Greetings, Seattle, and everyone else who may be watching this from anywhere else around the world. My name is Rev Erika Allison. I am an interfaith and interspiritual minister. And it was very important for me and my colleagues, who I'll be introducing you to very shortly, to have a piece of this month's Pride festivities include queer spirituality. This is an issue that is near and dear to all of our hearts, and we have a shared intention here of being able to offer some healing and some hope for anyone who's listening to this who may want to go deeper with spirituality or just try to deal with past wounds. We're not going to be shy about saying that harm has been done in many cases when it comes to the intersection of spirituality and queerness. And so we want to just offer a space here that is a safe, welcoming, accepting space that can hopefully help to create a new paradigm and open some doors on this topic of queer spirituality. So I want to set up a few quick norms or ground rules at the beginning of this. You're going to be hearing from several spiritual practitioners today. I want to go ahead and say up front that no one here is being the complete representation of the spiritual tradition that they come from. What you'll be hearing today is everyone's unique experiences as they experience their spirituality. So you'll hear their stories, but it's not necessarily a representation of the entire tradition, the entire religion, but it's meant to be an inquiry and hopefully to spark some self-reflection, some curiosity, and we really look forward to sharing this experience with you. So with that being said, it is my pleasure to begin to introduce you to our panelists today. I'd like to start with a round where we're all going to say who we are and kind of how we orient ourselves, setting some context for you, who we are, where we're coming from, what lineage we're coming from, and kind of what brings us to this moment today. So I'll start with opening the floor to Diane. So Diane, go ahead and give us a little bit about who you are and what brings you here and what context you're coming from.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. So it is a joy to be here with this group and on Pride weekend in a setting that's really celebrating each person's spiritual path. And I am, my pronouns are she, her. I'm associate minister at Seattle Unity here in Seattle, Washington. And Unity is a national, international religion and faith tradition. And I grew up in Unity, which is rare. Many people find Unity after leaving a different Christian faith or tradition, or maybe they haven't had a religion or spiritual path before, and then they find Unity later on in their lives. So being a bisexual woman growing up in Unity, I think I'm also rare in that it has always been a very accepting place for me. So I know that is not everybody's story. I hear many people's story where there was deep wounding in their religion, their spiritual faith that they grew up in. And so for me, healing around past wounding around spiritual community has always been important to me. And so I'm happy to be here to be part of this conversation.
Beautiful. Thank you, Diane. I'd like to take it next to Sanj.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Diane. Hi, everyone. My name is Sanj Basha. I was asked to be on this panel, I'm pretty sure because I identify as Muslim and queer, but I am an multifaceted, multi-hyphenated creative director, facilitator, and consultant based out of here in Seattle, Washington, which is the unseceded territory of the Duwamish people. I am a sort of walking, breathing, somatic experience of what it means to dismantle all of the controlled narratives that I've been told my entire life, and really liberate my own voice and my own self beyond just what it means to be stifled by my identities, but what it really means to be a holistic, human, spiritual, embodied person. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with everyone and eliciting the wisdom of this panel, and also offering my own deep cultural path in hopes to inspire others. So thank you for having me.
Beautiful. And next, I'd love to introduce everyone to Jay Michaelson.
Hi, also really a pleasure to be here. Greetings from New York. I am coming to you from my home in Brooklyn. And for me, my way into this panel probably is that I'm the gay rabbi, but a little bit piggybacking on what Sanj just said, I think a lot of us in the queer spiritual universe have hyphenated and hybridized and multi-whatever faceted identities and ways of being in the world. So I also am authorized to teach in a Theravadan Buddhist tradition from Sri Lanka, and I'm also really nourished by earth-based traditions as a longtime radical fairy. So I'm kind of at those different locations. I study religion. I don't work as an academic, but I'm a visiting scholar at the Center for LGBTQ Studies in Religion, and do a lot of work at the spirituality, sexuality, gender intersections.
Fabulous. And next, I'd love to introduce everyone to Pratima.
Good evening, everyone, and namaste. Namaste is a Sanskrit greeting, and what it means is the God that I am having this human experience. I see you, I recognize you, I validate you, and I affirm your existence just as my own. And so, again, I say namaste to all of you. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I am a sacred artist, and I choose to say sacred artist because spirituality in itself and accepting that and claiming that and affirming that is a spiritual art, and it's a sacred art. And I'm based out here in New York City, like I said. I've been working with Sadhana, Coalition of Progressive Hindus, to promote and to perpetuate oneness for everyone, and to essentially know what it's like to have a community that's not so grounded in religion and fair and about casting anyone out, but it's more so about spirituality, nurturing, healing, oneness, social justice, and about creating a safe space and an environment that's considered to be a beloved community, or Vasudeva Kutumbakam, where the world can be one family. So that's me.
Welcome and thank you. Jay Johnson.
Hi, thank you, Erika, and thanks to the other panelists very much. I'm very happy to be here and to be included in this group. I am ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church and a Christian theologian. For many years, I taught at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California, which is part of the Graduate Theological Union there, which is, as you may know, a multi-religious, multi-faith and spiritual path kind of place. It's a wonderfully diverse place to be, to learn, to grow into a religious and spiritual path. I was very happy to be there for many years. And then last summer, I moved to where I am now. I'm in Saugatuck, Michigan, and I decided to return to full-time congregational ministry as a parish priest. I'm at All Saints Episcopal Church in Saugatuck, and I am sitting here in the rectory, which is right on the lakeshore of Lake Michigan, and happy to be here. It's sort of bizarre to have done this during a pandemic, to put it mildly, but very happy to be on this path and happy to share whatever insights I might be able to offer about at least one aspect of Christian spiritual practice among LGBTQ people, and to learn from the other panelists tonight. I'm eager to learn from them. So thanks.
So this is us coming to you from literally across the country, and hoping that you're meeting us from wherever it is that you are. We invite you to make yourself comfortable, open your hearts, open your minds. We'd love to dive into this topic. I hope one of the things you're already noticing is the varied paths of the panelists tonight. I hope it's offering some inspiration already for ways to do this that might be different than the way that was told to you in the past or presented to you in the past. Hope there are some invitations here to consider some alternative pathways, and that's really what we want to open up now in this next phase of our discussion. We'd like to hear from each of the panelists about their journey. What has your spiritual journey been like? What got you to this point? What is it? What have you gone through? What has it been like? And how did you get here? And we'll go ahead and go in the same order as we did on this last one. So we'll start with Diane.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, having grown up in unity, which has its roots in Christianity and the Christian faith tradition, but is also open to and honors and respects all different religions and faith traditions. So having grown up in that, in a very open kind of spiritual path, I don't take that lightly, because it has been an incredible gift. And within our current Seattle Unity community, it's a vibrant LGBTQ community that welcomes people and is open to them. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that there aren't individuals within a spiritual community that still have judgments and biases. And so I have had experiences of that from certain individuals within a community, but on the whole, I think my story is a little bit rare in having grown up in unity, having grown up in a faith tradition and spiritual path that has been so welcoming. Now, the other thing that I'm grateful for is being able to kind of go forth and explore other spiritual traditions. So as Jay mentioned, I also have a strong affinity for earth-based paths and earth-based traditions, Buddhism, Judaism. It's that what calls me and what calls my spirit and my soul. And that has created a safe container for me to show up exactly who I am. And I know, again, that is a gift to be able to have that experience. And part of my mission and my goal is to be able to extend that gift to others. And in unity, we truly see every other individual as divine, as sacred, as holy, and deserving of that honoring. And so being able to reflect that amazing beauty that every single individual is in their diversity and uniqueness is a gift that I'm passionate about within my ministry and within my service in the world. And so again, just thank you for being part of this panel, joining us here today. And I think also just want to extend an invitation for those that maybe they've been searching, maybe they're just new on their spiritual path, or maybe they've kind of moved away from it because of some of the woundings that might have happened. That I think all of us here, although we have diverse backgrounds, we all are representing kind of different entry points into our spiritual paths and spiritual life. And so I personally want to extend an invitation for people to maybe be willing to explore that. And these are some entry points through our stories and our spiritual paths.
And Diane, can I just follow up with a question on that specifically as we're talking about our journeys? I'm just so curious to hear, what does it look like for you today? Like, what is your spiritual experience like? How does that show up in your life? How is it supportive? Like, tell us a little bit more about what it looks like in this moment for you.
Yeah, so very much my spiritual life is centered around so many of our unity principles. So at its root, unity is about practical spirituality. Its original name, the co-founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, that came out of the New Thought movement, they were very much about, this doesn't really make sense unless it has practical application in my life. And so it's very much about walking our talk. And because of that, it's centered around the power of prayer and meditation, these core principles that there is only one presence, one source, by whatever name you choose to name it, that we are each divine and holy and sacred. And we have power to shape our reality, shape our existence and our relationships and every element of our world and existence through the power of our consciousness, through the thoughts that we think, the emotions that we tend to. And so my spiritual life is very much grounded around these principles and practices at the core, prayer and meditation. And one of my aspirations, I would say, is to truly be a walking prayer in the world, and to, again, reflect that divinity back to each person that I meet and their amazing, unique beauty and diversity.
Thank you so much. So we'll go next to Sanj.
Thanks, Erika. Whoo, Diane cracked my heart open, which is good. that I'm following up. I forgot to mention that in English forward spaces, my pronouns are exclusively they, them, and theirs, or my name, which is Sanj. Speaking of English, I was born in Islamabad, Pakistan, but my family, currently most of them still reside and or migrated to the United States from Bangladesh. I have an incredibly unique journey, but I don't say that to compartmentalize myself from others. I wholeheartedly believe that there is no such thing as a monolithic idea of a spiritual journey, regardless of how one identifies. And so, speaking to my story of self, I'll say that I have the unique journey of actually being trafficked to the United States in 1988 when I was about 9 months old. My biological father was actually a white man who was a professor at a university here in Washington who had taken on the identity of and the surname of being a Muslim man, and went and married my very young 11-year-old mother and brought a ton of us back to Washington to live and labor and be enslaved on a farm in Centralia. So that's how I got here. And considering that like deeply wounded, traumatic journey that is an incredibly present historical context for my family, I'm super close with all of my family. And in fact, my cultural identity of my Muslim family has been one of the most loving, accepting, vivacious, open-armed communities that I identify with, which have been many in my 33 physical years of being here. So I will say that there was a pivotal moment in college. I graduated from Mills in Oakland, California. I studied women's gender and sexuality studies with critical race and queer theory. And I was also the president of the Muslim Alliance. And that was really a pivotal moment for me where I was reconciling like the multiplicity and the intersections of my identities as a young person. And that experience also really allowed me to, as Western narratives like to say, come out in many ways, come out as Muslim, come out as queer, come out as gender nonconforming and non-binary in a predominantly women-centered space, and all different kinds of things. So that was a moment in my spiritual journey that was really expansive. And I would say in the public sphere, I gave a keynote speech at the vigil for the Pulse nightclub that happened a couple of years ago. And the purpose of what I spoke to was really about how every spiritual and religious practice that I've ever come across talks about love, right? And talks about love in this way where it's like dismantling notions of hate. But I noticed that in the media, that moment was such a moment where we as a culture and as a society could have leaned into hate. Like people couldn't decide if they were had hard feelings against the shooter because he was Muslim or because he hated gays or because he was a man or what it was, but it was like just a bunch of hate and blame. And I really found it necessary to spread more messages of what it means when we don't compartmentalize each other and we don't compartmentalize parts of ourselves, and how that actually brings us closer to finding love and healing and reconciliation when there are collective traumas and individual traumas. So that was another pivotal part of my story and journey. And lastly, I would say that doing that really opened up my eyes to how much of I've allowed myself to be stifled in being seen and really being authentic and really being vulnerable, versus like how beautiful and amazing it is when I lean into allowing other people to see me for my whole self and trusting the process of that. So that is where I've landed. And June actually usually falls in the month of Ramadan, coincidentally enough, but this year we just skated out of it or else I would probably be a lot more flustered from some kind of fasting. So lucky for y'all, we are not in Ramadan, but we did recently pass it, and it was a really important time for my family. And I think it's kind of meaningful that it falls around Pride. There's some divine timing there for sure. So yeah, thank you for letting me share a little bit of my journey. And as I continue to move through not just this panel, but like my life and all of the work that I do, I always try to bring my story and my lineage with me and presence it in order to use it as a tool of actually like really radically moving forward to dismantle just a lot of hate in the world that we live in.
Thank you, Sanj. Jay, would you like to share with us about your journey?
Sure. It's fascinating always to hear these stories of the journey. I think that's, to me, part of the essence of the choice to integrate queer sexuality, gender experience, and something called spirituality, whatever that means to different people, that there is this journey of different stages and different phases. For myself, there are kind of three of those stages. I grew up kind of in a Jewish American context that is maybe familiar for some of us from popular culture. But I was always a bit of a weirdo. I was attracted I was attracted to a kind of vibrant spirituality from a very young age. I was very interested in mysticism. I became what's called a nightstand Buddhist, which means I had Buddhist books on my night table. But I found a lot of that kind of spiritual joy in my Jewish tradition. So in my 20s, so it's kind of the 1990 to 2001 decade, I was quite traditionally practicing. So I looked like an Orthodox Jew, and I was very interested in that kind of spirituality. I was studying Kabbalah. Eventually, I got a PhD in Jewish thought, specializing in Jewish mysticism and Jewish Kabbalah, and was really richly informed by that. But at a certain point, the kind of repression that was necessary to continue to live in that world just wasn't working for me. So I did face what felt like a pretty painful choice at the time, because I loved my spiritual practice and I loved my religious practice, but it really did seem to be impossible to reconcile that with living a full, authentic, loving, erotic, embodied life. And what happened to me was maybe a familiar contradiction to people who have experienced that tension, or that between what I later called kind of God versus gay, but between spirituality and queerness, that what was told to me as like this would be the end of my spiritual life, which would be coming out and leaving that container of traditional religion, was actually the beginning of my spiritual life. It was this real irony. All of the things that I had feared that would shut me down actually opened me up. And so I kind of spent the next 10 years, the 30s decade of my biological life, doing a lot of that kind of integration work professionally. So I was a LGBTQ activist professionally for about 10 years, at first working within the Jewish community. I wrote a book called God versus Gay, The Religious Case for Equality, which was part of the whole sort of period, I guess it would be around 2005 to 2015, 16 or so, where there was a real shift in mainstream attitudes towards, I would say LGBTQ, but primarily towards some sort of mainstream subset of that spectrum, and was very active in doing some of that work within religious communities. So speaking at a couple of hundred total in the end, churches, synagogues, community centers, basically anyone who would have me kind of telling this story, that the overwhelming majority of kind of mainstream American religious values, shared religious values, supported not just inclusion, but supported the full kind of acceptance, recognition, admiration of the spectrum of genders and sexualities which exist on the planet. Alongside that, I was doing a lot of kind of work within my Jewish community. I started 2 LGBTQ Jewish nonprofits, kind of celebrating and exploring the differences that queerness might bring that are in a productive way to Jewishness. And all along, as I mentioned before, also getting a little bit more serious about meditation practice in my Buddhist life, and really trying to ground my spirituality in the body in some of the earth-based traditions that I was working with at that time, which I'm happy to talk more about later. That eventually kind of, I shifted also again about 8 or 9 years ago, sort of felt like the work that I had done there had reached a certain stage of completion. So I still do it. Even this morning, I was teaching a class on queer and Kabbalah for a progressive yeshiva here in New York. But most of my work for the last 10 years has been at a weird intersection of journalism and meditation. So I write a lot of books about spirituality, and I now work as a professional Buddhist for a meditation app and company, and reaching really wonderful communities and audiences with the kind of the liberation of the Dharma as I've experienced it in a way that hopefully can resonate for folks, especially we've seen that over the last year. And at the same time, while I'm sort of relaxing people on that side of my professional career, hopefully stressing them out on the other. I've always been an activist, and so now my activism is through my journalism. I'm an opinion writer, so I get to have opinions rather than a reporter, and spent, like all of us, the last several years trying to help folks survive this resurgence or reassertion of white supremacy in America, and trying to hang on and help folks through that period who are in more vulnerable positions than I. And so that's been kind of what's animated me has been that juncture of spirituality and social justice for these last 10 years of my professional life, but it's all saturated with queerness. It's not like that's gone away because I don't do that professionally anymore. It's certainly that kind of transgressing of boundaries and that sort of hopeful attempt at solidarity with other communities who are marginalized. We don't always succeed at that, but with that aspiration, that's been kind of really nourishing for me over these last few years.
Thank you, Jay. I'm hearing a theme around sacred activism. That's yet another way of accessing this place of queer spirituality that we're discussing here. Pratima, can you tell us a bit about your spiritual journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, everyone, good night, namaste. So my spiritual journey, I would say, happened since my birth. And I say that because I come from a lineage of Hindu priests. And my family are actually from Guyana, which is in South America. My ancestors were brought as indentured laborers from India to the West Indies, and from the West and from Guyana, my parents decided to migrate to the United States. So essentially holding on to culture and holding on to this religion and reclaiming it, because through colonialism and through migration and through patriarchy and among a bunch of other components, we actually lost a lot of our connection to ancient spiritual healing methods and practices, i.e. yoga or meditation, which is something that it astounds me that as people that look like me within my community, as Guyanese Indians, that we have to go and pay millions or thousands of dollars to learn yoga or even reclaim what yoga and spirituality is, and have to be retaught it all over again. So with that being said, spirituality to me is something that, like I say, it's something that I want our world to feel comfortable in reclaiming, because through trauma, through religion, through churches or temples or mosques or whatever big organization that's essentially created for people to go and practice their spirituality, there is especially exclusion for people who may identify as queer, or let's say that within religions that there are other smaller micro religions within that, and it plays a lot of roles in it. So myself, growing up in the home of a Hindu priest, dealing with a lot of sexism, dealing with colorism, dealing with, oh, you're not Indian enough, then I'm also a queer woman at that. And growing up, I didn't see much inclusion for queer people, or for women either, or for queer priests. And it was never really talked about. It was never something that was even given an opportunity to be discussed. So in my mid-20s, when I started exploring my own orientation openly, and I started dating a woman, and I started exploring what non-conforming gender really means, and to just exist as a human being, then through my own spiritual awakening, through my own understanding, and through kind of like relearning Hinduism or ancient Indian spirituality to what I believe that it should be, especially through my own meditative practices, through learning yoga, through learning Kundalini, and also just learning the connections through true spirituality, and how it actually connects in different cultures. And I see spirituality versus religion because for me there's a very big difference. Religion to me plays a very, very big role in activating hatred and really shoving people aside to say pick a side or pick a god or you don't belong. Whereas my belief system and my understanding of Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism is just that we just all pray to God in different uh, representations, but they all essentially have the same name. And what that God is a direct reflection of us, the human beings, the cells. And there are layers and layers of past life karmas, colonialism, trauma, white supremacy, all of these things that essentially play into my decision to become a queer priestess, officiant. Like I said, I'm coming home right now from a Hindu queer wedding that I'm officiating this weekend, and because one of the girls' moms didn't show up, I'm playing the mom role. I'm being the sister. I'm also the priestess. So I decided to step into this role for people like me who may not have representatives, to be there for them and to help them to reclaim a part of themselves, which are their spiritual beings, which is their ancestry, which is their culture, which is to just be a part of society. And so I'm an organizer, I'm a priestess, I'm a student. I work and collaborate with different platforms, the Coalition of Progressive Hindus, the Interfaith Society in New York, now Seattle Pride. Thankfully, I've done Canada Pride, and let's say that it's not necessarily in Pride platforms. I actually love being a protagonist that gets to walk into hyper-religious spaces and say, well, I'm here. Let's see how far you're willing to contradict your spirituality by telling me that I don't belong when Hinduism says that I do. And so I take that metaphor and I go out into the world with it, because I don't believe that Hinduism are just for Hindus, but I believe that it's for the world, as our spirituality and our core basis is inclusion for everyone. So that's just a little bit about why I do what I do and why it's so important to me.
Thank you so much, Pratima. Jay, let us hear a bit about your spiritual journey.
Thanks, Erika. And wow, I've been actually sitting here taking notes, learning so much from these other panelists. It's such a privilege to be here with all of you, and I'm very grateful for what you're offering to this conversation tonight. Thank you. A little bit about my story. I grew up outside of Chicago in sort of the heart of evangelical Christianity, and was a student, graduated from Wheaton College. You may know of that place outside of Chicago, and came out as a gay man there, and was presented with what many people in institutional Christian circles are presented with, which was a choice that either I embrace my gay identity or retain my Christian identity, but not both. And for whatever reason, I don't know, God's grace, I inherited my mother's stubbornness, I don't know what it was, I just refused to make the choice. And I embarked on what many others have done as well, which was a journey of trying to reconcile Christian faith with my identity as a gay person. And I refer to that as the sort of justification task. You're justifying your presence in the church, and so many of us spent so many years refuting certain biblical passages and texts and ways of justifying being present as a gay person in Christian traditions. And so that was a really important part of my 20s years ago, my post-college years of integrating my Christian faith and my sexuality. And that's very important for many people to do in Christian traditions and other traditions too, is that sort of apologetic task, really. But that to me was not enough. There was a really important next step to take, which I have since then referred to as the constructive task. And by that, I mean trying to identify what LGBT queer people and communities offer to the ongoing evolution of religious traditions and spiritual practices. That there's something about queer communities and queer people that is important to understand and articulate for the sake of shared spiritual practices and for particular religious traditions. And so after going to seminary and being ordained as an Episcopal priest and serving in a parish for a few years outside of Chicago, I decided to go back to school again, and I got a PhD in Christian theology and started working very shortly after that in Berkeley, as I mentioned, trying to figure out how to articulate and name these gifts that queer people and queer communities offer very specifically to Christian traditions. So I taught queer theory and queer studies in religion at Pacific School of Religion, mostly through a Christian lens. And really, I also spent some time, the other Jay on the panel here and I crossed paths a few times during those years back in the early 2000s-ish. I can't remember the dates now, Jay, but around the marriage equality stuff and around some of those spiritual activism days, sacred activism days of trying to push the needle a little bit farther toward justice for LGBTQ people from a religious perspective. Did a lot of that work. And then really settled into retrieving important and often neglected aspects of Christian spiritual practice over the centuries that have surfaced precisely because of all this work around LGBT inclusion in Christian traditions. And part of what I have found absolutely remarkable, insightful, life-giving to me and for others is realizing that the decades-long debate that so many Christian churches have had around gay and lesbian people mostly, and more recently on other issues, whether it's around trans and non-binary folks and so on, but the decades-long wrestling matches that Christian churches and theologians have had over these topics have actually surfaced some aspects of Christian traditions that have long been either repressed or forgotten or neglected that turn out to be some truly life-giving, invigorating aspects of those traditions. Just one example is the important role that eros and eroticism played in the development of Christian theological traditions and biblical interpretation and spiritual and ritual practice, which blew my mind as I was doing a lot of that work over the last 20 years and working with some other scholars in that area, and recognizing how amazing it is that we may not have come to some of those texts and traditions and insights apart from some of this other really painful and hard work that we've had to do over the decades of repairing our religious traditions because of the homophobia and the misogyny that has infected them. I really rambled through that story really quickly, but I hope that when we come back to our sort of roundtable conversation with each other, we can maybe start sharing some of those insights around what it is we think. We've already started doing that, I know, but I'm really eager to hear from you all about what it is we offer as queer people, queer communities, to the ongoing work of spiritual practice, however we might be defining that. I find that to be a really important way of framing this particular topic. So thanks for letting me ramble, and especially for letting me listen and learn.
Wonderful, Jay. And I actually want to jump in and just give a snippet of my story as well, just to add one more perspective on the spiritual journey before we get into our next round of questions. So my story is I grew up in Texas, And when I came out as a teenager, when I was around 18, my family and the church decided that conversion therapy was the right approach to help pray the gay away from me. So I'm one of those people who's been through conversion therapy. What I learned from that experience was a lot of internalized self-hatred. I walked away with the message that God didn't love me for who I was, that I was unlovable, that I was unworthy. And I wasn't fully conscious of those messages that I was carrying. I really repressed them because it was all I could do. I couldn't face them. They were too painful. So all I could do was repress them. And what I discovered is I went through a majority of my adulting life carrying those around repressed. And the way that kept showing up in my life was sabotaging relationships or trying to do things in life to prove that I was good enough. A lot of people pleasing, a lot of taking jobs that were just way overgiving and out of balance for me because I felt like I really needed to prove that I was a good person. And what really made the difference for me and what kind of opened the door to some healing was something a coach said to me about my inner judge. And the coach said to me that, you know, if you're afraid of people outside of you judging you, what that means is you're afraid that somebody's going to say something that validates what your inner judge is holding against you. And when he said that, it was like a light bulb went on for me. I didn't even realize I had an inner judge that was holding something against me. But when I really unpacked, he encouraged me to go and journal about that. And I went and journaled about it. And what I ended up finding in my journaling, when I asked the honest question of, what do I really think about myself? What came out was, I must be a monster because only a monster would hurt their family in this way. Only a monster would go against God's will, like all of these repressed feelings. And at that time I was in my 30s and I was thinking like, whoa, I'm not conscious of these thoughts. I wouldn't identify with these thoughts, but they were still in there and in me. And that really opened the path of healing for me to see that, to bring that to light and have that exposed, and then to start to unpack and notice the programming that came from these experiences and then begin to reprogram them, begin to find my inner compass again and trust myself again and find my inner truth and kind of surrender into a bigger view of spirituality, a more expansive view of spirituality than what I was kind of handed to me. That wasn't big enough for me, but could I find one that actually was inclusive and big enough for me? And one of the most healing experiences I had was walking into the seminary program that I went to and being completely celebrated for who I was. And that really has led me to want to become an interfaith minister. And that's why I do what I do today, because I want to help create spaces where queer people can feel not just accepted, like, okay, we'll give you a seat at the table. We guess we've sorted out our issues and we'll give you a seat at the table. But to take that one step further and say, no, you're actually celebrated, kind of as Jay was just mentioning, there are gifts that we have as queer people. I often say that we've had to go through bumping up against the system and having it not fit and not work for us, and come through what that means to not feel the belonging and then to find the belonging within self. And ironically, I feel like we're now in this unique position where we can help guide people, in some cases, those who might have been persecutors of us at some point, who are now going to be bumping up against the walls of the systems as we continue to expand as beings and in consciousness. We're going to be the guides of these people, of others who need a guide through this process of the kind of deconstruction and coming back to self and rebuilding. So that's just my angle of the story. And I wanted to say that now to open up the next question, which really is about, I want to dive into each of you again and hear about resources. We have 2 rounds to go here. So this next round, I'd love to hear about resources that exist that you're aware of. Spiritual resources, what is it that sustains you? What are spiritual resources that have really supported you, for those who are listening to this who are curious about exploring? And if there are resources that exist within your tradition that might be helpful for people to help make peace if that happens to be their tradition of origin. And this time we'll go the complete opposite order. So if we could go back to Jay Johnson for this one, we'll go in reverse order for this. So resources on both fronts, spiritual and religious.
Oh my goodness. I was hoping that I was going to go last like we did the last round so I could learn how yes. Anyway. Well, I was just mentioning the retrieval of ways of engaging with Christian spiritual practice through sort of an LGBT queer lens. And there are ways to do this. There are wonderful texts and books out there in terms of resources for dealing with the way that many people in Christian traditions have been beat up with biblical texts. And there's a way to understand better how to approach the sacred texts that are in Christian traditions in a way that can be life-giving. I can provide, if people would want to be in touch with me, a sort of a list of those if they want to. But there are the good news is that that book does not have to be a weapon by any means. It actually can be something that we can constructively engage with together. And so that's become a way for me to kind of reclaim a painful past and reappropriate those texts in a way that's life-giving. In Christianity itself, one of the things that I often say, and when I was teaching, and now that I'm doing full-time congregational ministry again, one of the things that I often say is Christianity did not begin with a text or a doctrine or an institution, but with radical social practice called table fellowship. And one of the ways to think about this, and what I mean by that, is in the Christian gospel texts, those gospel writers were fond of telling lots of stories about how Jesus was constantly getting into trouble for eating with the wrong people. And he, in that first century Mediterranean society, who you ate with was just as important as who you had sex with, because those were the primary ways that those societies maintained certain hierarchies of social value. And Jesus simply threw out all of those rules around table fellowship and who you would share food with. And there was a huge breakthrough of insight in those moments of who God might be around that table. God not being on the side of social hierarchies of value, but God on the side of open tables, of welcoming, of inclusion, of feasting, actually. And so the image of tables and of table fellowship and of shared meals actually is at the very heart of Christian spiritual practice over the centuries. It got distorted by institutional forces fairly early on, and part of my own work over the years has been how to retrieve table fellowship as a spiritual practice. And we know how to do this actually in queer communities, what it's like to throw fabulous dinner parties, what it's like to make sure that those who have been forgotten are welcomed. We know what this is like. We feel it in our bones and muscles, and actually there are ways to do that in Christian communities that can be really powerful. That is, by the way, why I went back to congregational ministry full time. I wanted to go back to doing that kind of community building work around the table. And I'm really happy to be doing it here at a place that's really saturated with artists and theater and all sorts of fun stuff like that, which is available to us. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jay. So it sounds like I'm hearing sacred dinner parties.
Absolutely right. Dinner
parties
we know how to do that. We know how to do that.
And Pratima, can you tell us a bit about practices that really call to you that people may want to learn more about, and resources that might exist within Hinduism for people who are looking for resources?
Oh, sure. So I would say that we have a ritual called puja. And puja is it's originally like a very elemental based ritual where you build God out of the elements. So let's say you saw a rock, or you saw soil, or you saw fire, or you saw like a body of water. We saw God in these elements before we started giving them names and faces, and we started depicting them by art, right? And that's what essentially gives a face to God. But what I would say is a holistic, meaningful practice to me is the art of puja or ritual, where I get to sit in worship, and let's say that I have an idol, right, of Ganesha, the elephant-headed deity, you know, I have a moment to have that intimate space and connection spiritually with a divine being that is supposed to be symbolic representative of a part of me. So each one of these gods that we pray to, it's essentially supposed to be a representation of one of your skill sets. So for example, Lord Ganesha is the god of wisdom. He actually, if you think about it, he resides in your cognitive area or in your cognitive space. He's also called Pratam Puj Devata. So he's the remover of all obstacles. That's why you go to him and embarking in any mission or any journey in life. And what this is, it's really about checking in with yourself. Do I have the ability to provide obstacles or to remove obstacles from my own path? So through the art of puja and ritual, I'm able to more and more acknowledge God and this ritual as a reflection of how I should be treating myself by offering myself milk, the best of milk baths. It's like a cosmic body. I should be treating myself with love and sweetness all the time and vulnerability. Um, and so the art of ritual, the art of puja, but really and truly meditation. Meditation is something that we call to be shruti, or nowadays there's something called metaphysical downloads, where you go into meditation and you have an awakening or an inspiration. We call that gyan sadhana or shakti, the power of divine inspiration that comes from your ancestors or comes from the divine word of God, or comes from your own divine plexus of spirituality, whatever that means. But it's really about finding and honing into your own idea of what it means to be God, what it means to be a divine being, and how that in itself helps you to reclaim your being here on earth. Now, resources, that's a hard one, because resources have been constantly rewritten and rewritten by other people's perceptions. But what I would say is the Devi Bhagavatam, or the glories of the goddess, or the Shiva Puran, where there are stories about Lord Vishnu, the god of sustenance, transitioning into a female and making love with Lord Shiva, the cosmic destroyer, and they have a son. Or stories of men going into garden and becoming women, and then being with other women, or you know, different experiences of what it really means to kind of like not pay so much mind to the physical aspect of existence, which is just this borrowed vehicle that evolves this physical body, because we're not confined to just this physical state, but we really and truly subscribe to the atma, the soul, and our soul, which essentially is here on earth, which is why we've been invoked in this physical aspect as a human being. And dharma, the word dharma means purpose. It means your divine purpose. So going into these different scriptures, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, they're all kind of saying the same thing, but the message is really and truly ekatva, inclusion for all. It is also about embracing the duality, the yin and yang of bitterness and sweetness at the same time, because you can't coexist without each other. You can't have night without day. And our scriptures, when they're not being so misogynistic and patriarchal, or or kind of trying to transcend or trickle down this idea of caste system, what it really is, it's a manual to self-reflection and how to really, really become one with yourself, your society, and take care of your society by seeing each other as God.
Thank you so much, Pratima. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Jay, we'll go to you. If you have any resources to share that might be helpful, practices or resources within either of the traditions that you represent.
So sure. I mean, for me, my predominant spiritual practice now is insight meditation, is just seeing clearly. And through my Jewish practice, I think sanctifying the various moments and oscillations of our lives and connecting those to what we value the most. I'm sort of interested a little bit in actually how queers transform some of these existing resources. You know, I'm really inspired. One of my favorite poems is by the lesbian Jewish poet Adrienne Rich. She has a poem called "Diving into the Wreck," where it's the metaphor of diving into a shipwreck to find that there might be treasure actually still in the shipwreck. And it culminates, she finds the stories in a book in which my name does not appear, she writes. I think that's a wonderful kind of sophisticated relationship to some of the retrieval and repair work that some queer folks are interested in doing around their spiritual traditions. And sometimes that manifests as camp, sometimes it manifests as irony, but it's always this kind of slightly queered, askewed, I think, relationship to certainly to tradition, which has always been used for as much oppression as liberation. And I think just the seeing of gender and race and so many other kinds of constrictions and boxes and categories as social constructions and as performances, discovering the already queer substrate within religious and spiritual traditions, the mismatch between those containers and our realities, which never conform quite to that. I think that's a gift that the experience of queerness can give to anyone. And to anyone seeing that that those categories aren't to be taken for granted. The queer theorists see that those socially constructed binary categories aren't just random and disinterested. They maintain power structures, right? And they enforce oppression. So any work that we do, I think, to destabilize that through the messy realities of our own existences, I see as kind of justice work. We might even apply something about the reality of love and reality of the body. I mean, you have to see what's real and what's powerful to decide or to be able to transcend some of the negative images that might be out there and the sort of constricting doctrines and so forth. So, my hope is that there's a way in which, too, that queers can start coming up with a little bit more solidarity, whether it's their intersectional lens or just a solidarity lens, understanding that the oppression that some of us experienced is still going on along all other vectors of oppression. That we're not here to sort of just deconstruct the one that affects me or that I perceive that affects me, but seeing that tendency, that human tendency to dichotomize, to compartmentalize, and to boxify, that every time that there's that division, that's also a hierarchy. And when there's a hierarchy, there's oppression. So those are some of the ways in which I think we transform the resources that are in our root traditions.
Amazing. Thank you, Jay. Let's go to Sanj.
All right, y'all, I'm going to speak with as much brevity as possible. Good thing I have a little note. So I just wanted to echo this idea that queer and trans people are magic. We are magical. We've always been magical. We've always existed on planet Earth since the beginning of humanity, and we're not going anywhere. And in fact, we're getting browner and queerer and weirder. And that is the truth, the divine truth. And with that, I actually turn to a lot of the spiritual practices as a Muslim, praying 5 times a day. While I might not do that anymore, and I did that growing up, ritual is radical. Ritual is a gift, ritual, however that shows up for all of us. And that when we find safety and groundedness in our rituals, I practice yoga, which the sun salute essentially looks like being on a prayer rug, right? I dance like queer house dance. Like, don't catch an Arab man doing the duck walk just traditionally. Like, it's real, right? Like, these are spiritual practices that are shared across the intersections of religion and identity. Meditation is like sitting and making dua for Muslim people, right? Like, these are all resources that I use. And I also turn to fellow divine people, like a lot of Christian theology that has to do with gayness, like Dr. Chapman's books on anthropology, Jewish Voices for Peace, who are really talk about pinkwashing and dismantling the colonial ethnic cleansing that's happening in Palestine right now. And I'll also just mention that, like, we don't have anyone that has specifically identified as Black or Indigenous on this call, but that, like, Black, Indigenous, trans women specifically are fucking magical, and they are one of the backbones of our queer societies. And so those are all resources. Those are my big shout outs. Thank you for letting me share. And I was honored to be here.
Beautiful. Thank you. Diane.
Yes. So, thank you, Sanj, and every single person on this panel. Just incredible, rich resources already shared. And I just want to amplify a certain theme that's come up, and it has been integral on my spiritual path. And that is really honoring our physicality, our physical body, and really all aspects of ourself. And so my spiritual path was truly kind of stalled until I really tended to my body and my physicality, to really honor all that we are as a mental, emotional, spiritual, physical being. And I think that is a gift that the queer community can give to spirituality, religion, spiritual paths. Because while I don't want to make an assumption, I'm going to say that probably inherent in most queer people's searching and inner searching is a look at their own sexuality and identity. And so for that reason, I think there's a real gift here to look at wholeness. And within unity, within my spiritual path, that wholeness has been so profound, of really honoring all that we are as a spiritual being, but also a physical being, and being able to integrate those in a beautiful way that's honoring and not discounting our physicality and all that we are as a human being walking this physical earth. And so thank you, Sanj, also for calling out so many of those practices that integrate our physical being with all that we are as a spiritual being and an amazing soul.
Amazing. Well, I just want to thank everyone so much. We want to invite you now actually to join us in a question and answer period. If you can stick around, that will happen right after this, and several of the panelists will be able to be there to talk with you further if this has sparked some questions for you. But in summary, just thank you to all of you who joined us today and listened in. A thank you to each panelist for being here. And if you would like to get in touch with anyone on this panel, contact information has been provided in the notes of this discussion. And we would all love to hear from you. I know everyone on this panel would love to be contacted if you have further questions or to discuss this in more detail. That's what we all are very passionate about. So we welcome that. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, panelists, and happy Pride, everyone.